Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cheryl Randall. I am the Climate Change Campaign Organizer at Ecology Ottawa, and I am really excited to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We're looking forward to a great discussion. Now, just while people are joining, I'm going to just do a few introductory remarks. So let's go. Now, you can probably see already that our webinar is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, please feel free to take off your camera. Of course, we love to see your smiling faces though. The recording will be available later in the next week and will be sent to everybody who RSVP'd, because I know we're all very busy people. Okay, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on unsurrendered, unceded Algonquin territory, the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Today we're being joined by Dr. Laura Monette, all the way over in Victoria, and so we celebrate these 634 different First Nations communities, 53 Inuit communities and 8 Métis settlements across this country, which we today call Canada. Each has a unique historical, spiritual, cultural, and environmentally sustainable connection to the land, and their people and ancestors have been dedicated to looking after this land since time immemorial. So as organizations and individuals supporting the environment and justice, we are deeply grateful to Indigenous peoples for their ongoing stewardship of these lands. Now, there will be a question and answer session after the presentations today, so please do add your questions to the chat so that we can get answers for you. This project is made possible by the generous foundation support of the Trottier Family Foundation. And for those of you who do not know us, Ecology Ottawa is a non-profit grassroots organization, volunteer driven, and we are focused on providing residents. Sorry, I'm so distracted because there are so many people entering the room, but William, I'm handing that over to you. We are dedicated to providing residents with the information and tools that they need so that they can understand local government issues, environmental issues, and a means to influence municipal and provincial government. So today we will hear from 2 experts who will discuss the climate and health implications of traffic-related air pollution, which comes from traditional school buses, diesel exhaust. Dr. Laura Monette from the Clean Air Laboratory at the University of Victoria, and Dr. Eugenie Waters, family physician and Cape Ontario Regional Committee physician. Thank you both very much for joining us today. Now, with transportation comprising a whopping 42% of our emissions right here in our nation's capital, at Ecology Ottawa, we've been working on many projects related to curbing those emissions, from air quality monitoring, campaigning against urban sprawl, focusing on 15-minute neighborhoods. And this particular program, pushing for the electrification of our school buses, follows a lengthy campaign alongside the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa, and I see Raymond here with us today. Hello Raymond, thank you for joining us, for Ottawa's transit fleet to be electrified. And we are celebrating the victory of Ottawa City Council confirming just a couple of weeks ago that the OC Transpo fleet will be electrified. Now, in terms of getting our children to school in the healthiest way possible, we know that this is just one part of a bigger picture. We want to be enabling our children to walk to school, to cycle to school where they can. But for the over 800,000 children in Ontario who take the school bus every day, we know that choosing an electric bus can help us to, and I should say, choosing an electric bus when the traditional diesel bus reaches their end of life can simultaneously help us to meet our climate targets, reduce the overwhelming burden on our healthcare system, and address the equity issue of lower income neighbourhoods having higher emissions exposure. Now, we did have an electric school bus pilot program in Ontario, which was cancelled in 2018 when the Progressive Conservatives took power. And currently we have only 20 school buses which are electric out of our fleet of 20,000, which is shocking if you ask me. Anyway, as part of our campaign, we have researched the climate, health, and economic aspects of transitioning the fleet. In terms of emissions, transitioning just one school bus to electric can save somewhere between 17 to 20 tons of carbon a year. So looking across all of Ontario's fleet, that would be more than 4 million tons of carbon over the 12-year lifespan of the fleet. In terms of health, we know that Health Canada has written numerous reports on traffic-related air pollution and the negative health impacts, particularly of diesel emissions. And CAPE has produced seminal work on the studies of these negative health effects. And finally, looking at the economics, we know that the upfront cost of an electric school bus is higher than a traditional bus, but over the lifetime, with the lower cost of energy and significantly lower maintenance costs, the total cost of ownership is in fact cheaper for an electric bus. And there are a whole host of indirect economic benefits, which I don't have time to go into right now, but I encourage anybody who is interested to please read our report. I'll put a link to that in the chat shortly. Now, in recognition of the higher upfront cost of electric school buses, the federal government has set up the Zero Emission Transit Fund, which is $2.75 billion to meet 50% of the cost of the upfront cost of a school bus, as well as the associated charging infrastructure. And when we look across the country, the provinces which have started to accelerate this transition are those with provincial funding support. So we want to take this issue to the provincial government, the Transportation Ministry, which funded the pilot in 2017, and we want them to provide funding to leverage this federal funding. How can you get involved? First up, we'd say read the report, of course. We have a petition on our website, which we'll be taking to Queen's Park. We have a template on our website of a school board delegation if you wanted to go to your elected school board trustees. And we're asking them to write open letters of support to the provincial government for funding. And reach out to your councillor, your MPP and your MP, because it is time that they heard your voice on what you want to see change here. Okay, I am turning off my share. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Laura Monet. She is an assistant professor in civil engineering at the University of Victoria. Her research addresses, I'm just going to jump out of there. Her research addresses the issues of traffic-related air pollution and population exposure to air pollution. Her current topics of interest include the design of sustainable transportation systems that minimize population exposure to air pollution and the impact of climate change and climate change mitigation strategies on urban air quality. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto and now heads up the Clean Air Lab at UVic. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Monet.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I'm going to talk about the health and climate benefits of cleaner vehicles in the context of a study I led while at the University of Toronto. So not in Victoria, not in Ottawa, but for the greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So just to start, this is a reminder of what on-road transportation emissions look like in Canada and in cities. So nitrogen oxides, NOx, and black carbon are two air pollutants that we call markers of traffic-related air pollution, meaning that they're really high concentrations near roads because they're mainly emitted by transportation, on-road transportation in cities. So nitrogen oxides represent 22% of the on-road transportation sector, sorry, represent 22% of the total NOx emissions in Canada. And for black carbon, it's pretty similar. Nitrogen oxide, a marker of gasoline and diesel emissions. Black carbon is what we also call soot, and it's really a marker of diesel emissions. So we're going to have a high concentration of black carbon where we have trucks and buses that run with diesel. But if we want to reduce air pollution, we need to understand what are the different factors that impact air quality and how, and so they can basically be divided into 4 main categories. The emissions, of course, are going to play an important role in air quality. We've seen before that traffic represents a large proportion of the emissions of air pollutants in cities in Canada. And there is a high correlation between traffic emissions and air quality. But this is not the only factor that's going to impact air quality. Chemical reactions are going to occur between different air pollutants, and this is going to depend on what types of air pollutants are here around. You can have some particles that are going to get created because you have nucleation events. You also have particles that can coagulate together to form larger particles. So chemical reactions play an important role in air quality. The third influential factor is meteorology. It's going to have an impact on the dispersion and the chemical reactions of air pollutants. So if you have lots of wind, you're going to have dispersion of air pollutants, but the temperature, the relative humidity are going to have an impact on the coagulation of particles. The solar radiation can have an impact on the formation of new pollutants, such as ozone. And the fourth influential factor is urban design. So because that's going to have an impact on the dispersion of air pollutants. If you have high buildings, they're going to trap air pollution in between them. This is what we call the urban canyon effect. But if you have residential areas, infrastructure such as schools, offices, hospitals that are located close to major roads, you're going to have an impact on what the population is breathing. So when we talk about air quality, it's really important to remember that yes, emissions are important, but that's not the only aspect to population exposure to air pollution. So I'm going to talk here about 2 case studies I've led for the region of Toronto. First one was looking at the health burdens of on-road vehicles in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which is the GTHA. And then what are the climate and health benefits of getting cleaner vehicles on the roads in the GTHA? So as we've seen before, we can't just look at emissions to really understand whether the health impacts of on-road vehicles. We need to look at as well meteorology, chemical reactions, land use. And so I'm going to here give you a brief overview of how we modeled scenarios, what we did to answer those questions. So the modeling framework is based on what we call a chemical transport model. So this is an air quality model that uses information on emissions, on land use, on meteorology, and that's going to give information on air pollutant concentration. So given different scenarios of emissions, different meteorology conditions or land use, what are air pollutant concentrations? What do they look like? When we looked at here was very interested in looking at what was the impact of on-road vehicles on air quality, but we also had to look at all types of emissions of air pollutants in the region of concern. And so this includes power plant emissions, traffic emissions, so emissions from private vehicles, commercial vehicles, transit buses, emissions of other anthropogenic sources, agriculture, shipping, but also natural sources. And so taking into account all those emissions, land use and meteorology, what do air pollutant concentrations look like? A bit of focus here on traffic emissions, because that's what was really interesting for us. How did we have the best model of traffic emissions? Well, we used what we call a traffic assignment model. So this is a model that's going to give information on what traffic flows are in a city. So on each road of a city, how many vehicles are driving every day, every hour of every day? What is their speed? And so given this information, and looking at what is the average emission from a vehicle, we can infer what the emissions of all different types of on-road vehicles, so private vehicles, commercial vehicles, and transit buses is. So we looked at different scenarios of traffic emissions, which I talk a bit briefly after, and so looked at what this would mean in terms of air pollutant concentrations over the GTHA. But the next step we're interested in looking at is how is this impacting the health of the population. So if we have more electric vehicles, if we have less trucks, how does it translate into air quality and how does it translate into health? So to do that, we quantify the health outcomes associated with changes in emissions and changes in air quality in terms of years of life lost and number of premature deaths. So the study area, as I said, was the greater Toronto and Hamilton area. It's housing about 7 million inhabitants. There's 6 regional municipalities here, lots of traffic. And so just to give you a brief overview of what emissions from the on-road transportation sector look like in the region. Here, these are the NOx nitrogen emissions in the GTHA. Most of the traffic-related NOx emissions, well, more than half come from trucks, a third from cars and SUVs, so private vehicles, and a smaller portion from public transit buses. When we look at black carbon, which I said was soot and really a marker of diesel, trucks are largely responsible for most of the emissions of black carbon because they're running with diesel. And also a small portion from cars, SUVs, and public transit buses. When we look at greenhouse gases emissions, however, it's really cars and SUVs that are responsible for the largest emissions. And that's because there's so many cars around that this is the case. So if we want to tackle both air quality issues and greenhouse gas emission issues, there's no silver bullet. We basically have to tackle emissions from all different types of vehicles. So coming back of the case studies I was talking about, first one I wanted to look at the health burdens of different vehicle categories. So we looked at a base case, which we considered emissions from private vehicles, so cars and SUVs, emissions from trucks, and emissions from public transit buses. And then we removed the emissions from each type of vehicle separately and run the big modeling framework I presented before, the air quality model, to try to understand what this would mean in terms of improvements in air quality if we didn't have emissions from private passenger vehicles or emissions from commercial vehicles. So these are maps showing our results in terms of years of life lost per 1,000 capita. So the red color is going to show locations where we're saving, there's the highest number of years of life lost that can be attributed to each vehicle category. So the first map shows where the years of life lost are attributed to emissions to private vehicles. And then the second map shows years of life lost attributed to emissions from trucks. And then the third one for public transit buses. So when we look at cars and trucks, the distribution is more or less similar. We see a lot of red next to highways. Here we have the airport as well. So where we have lots of traffic of private vehicles and trucks, this is where the population living to those zones of traffic are the most impacted and losing the most years of life. When we look at public transit buses, they mainly drive in the city of Toronto. So it's really the city, inhabitants of the city of Toronto that are affected by those emissions. I've also indicating here the number of premature deaths per year that can be attributed to each of those vehicles in the region. And so 143 premature deaths attributed to public transit exhaust emissions from public transit buses, up to 400 for when we consider emission from trucks. So pretty significant numbers. But then we also wanted to look at what if we had cleaner vehicles on our roads? What would be the climate and health benefits? And so we considered still our base case with here private vehicles, transit buses, and trucks, and then 3 different scenarios. First scenario was looking at what would happen in terms of air quality and population health if all our private vehicles were electric. What would happen, the second scenario, if all our transit buses were electric? And the third scenario is looking at what would happen if trucks were cleaner. So not electric, because this is still a long way from now, in terms of battery capacity and so on. But what if all the trucks had a more recent technology and their emissions were reduced compared to, so they were more efficient. Looking at the impacts in terms of GHG emissions, we really see, so on the left, we have the base case. So these are greenhouse gas emissions from traffic in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent per day. So almost 35,000 under a base case. So what's happening right now in the region of Toronto. If all the cars and SUVs, so private vehicles, were electric, we would save 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's even accounting for additional electricity needed for fueling those EVs. So here we accounted for increased electricity production from power plants in the region of Toronto. Limited greenhouse gas savings in comparison when we only electrify public transit buses or when we change trucks into cleaner trucks. How does it reflect in terms of years of life saved per 100,000 capita? So this is the green is going to show you where is the location of people that are benefiting the most from improvements in air quality resulting from those cleaner vehicles on the road. In terms of number of premature death prevented, it's really, we see drastic like larger numbers when we have 100% of electric vehicles or when we have cleaner trucks on the roads, really highlighting the benefits of looking at a more recent diesel motors for trucks. We still have as well 143 premature death prevented if we had electric transit buses in the city. The biggest difference is in terms of GHG emissions saved. So as we had seen, private vehicles are responsible for the largest GHG emissions. And so it's not surprising that when we switch to electric vehicles, that's where we're going to save the most GHG emissions. And so these are similar graphs, but in that case, we also looked at scenarios when it was 100% electric vehicles, but on the left, 25%, and then in the middle, 50% of electric vehicles. And it's really proportional. So in terms of number of the amount of GHG emissions that are saved under each of these scenarios is really proportional to the percentage of electric vehicles on the road. And this is pretty similar for a number of premature deaths that would be prevented thanks to those electric vehicles on the road. So this concludes my presentation. Just like to acknowledge my co-authors, different funding sources for this work. And I'd be happy to take questions after. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Minet. That was excellent, very interesting. We are going to save your questions for the end, if that's okay. But if you think of some now that you have for Dr. Minet, please do type them in the chat, and we will make sure that she at least answers some of them. We'll give her lots of difficult questions. sure. Now, I would like to, sorry, I'm just joking. I'd like to introduce Dr. Eugenie Waters. Dr. Waters is a community family physician in Ottawa. She also works part-time as a hospitalist in medical oncology. I'm sure she'll tell us what that means. She's a lecturer in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine, and she has taught medical students and faculty about planetary health. She's been involved in a variety of efforts to create a more sustainable healthcare system and advocating to mitigate and address the health impacts of climate change. Dr. Waters is a physician with the Ontario Regional Committee of CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Now, I would like to welcome you, and I will share your slides, Dr. Waters.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Minet, for that really interesting first presentation. So you can move ahead to the next slide there, Cheryl. So I have no disclosures regarding this topic, aside from the fact that I send my 2 kids to school every day on a diesel school bus, and I am really excited about this campaign. So thank you for the invitation to speak. Next. So everyone is aware that the strain on our healthcare system is considerable, but that's not really the subject of this webinar. Regardless, I think it's really important to know that there's a lot that everyone can do, even if you don't work in the healthcare system, to improve the health of individuals and communities, including this type of work. Next slide. So prevention is always the best medicine, both at an individual and a population level. And we're already seeing the health impacts of climate change across Canada, and they're significant. So every 0.1% of a degree of warming that we can prevent will save lives. And investing in primary care and public health policy that reduces illness and disability in particular also reduces the carbon intensity of providing healthcare itself. Next. So this image highlights how we can view health and interventions to promote and protect health at different scales. So obviously the individual level, the population level, so we call that public health. And then if you zoom all the way out to planetary health, which is the newest framework that recognizes that human health and Earth's natural processes are deeply intertwined. And these are interconnections that have been long acknowledged by Indigenous teachings. And the planetary health movement is scaling up quite rapidly. For example, we now have a director of planetary health at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Hussein Malou. And he's been really busy increasing capacity for planetary health at all levels of medical education. Next. So how does this connect to diesel school buses? This campaign to accelerate the transition from diesel emitting buses to electric school buses is really a planetary health intervention. So reducing exposure to harmful traffic related air pollution and especially diesel emissions can directly improve health outcomes for school children, school bus drivers, and for anyone who lives near major roads or highways in our communities. And what's really great is that with air pollution improvements or reductions, the health benefits start to accrue right away. So we see immediate improvements in a number of health outcomes. Next. Much of what I'm going to outline today, as Cheryl mentioned, comes from some of these really important reports. So on the left, you see Mobilizing Evidence, which is a scoping review that was done by researchers with Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, looking at over 1,200 research papers at the traffic-related health impacts of air pollution. And it's easily accessible on the CAPE website. And then in 2020, Health Canada had this report on risk assessment of traffic-related air pollution in terms of asthma, allergies, and lung function in particular. And back in 2016, they had a very comprehensive report on health impacts of diesel exhaust in particular. Next. So TRAP is the acronym that's commonly used for traffic-related air pollution. So I'll use that mostly. And TRAP pollutants are emitted from vehicle exhaust as well as non-exhaust pathways, as Dr. Minet outlined. And diesel exhaust is kind of a complex mixture of gases, vapors, and particles. And we heard about, the nitrogen oxides and the black black carbon or soot that we see from diesel in particular. And the diesel particulate matter is very, very tiny, and this is a problem from a health point of view. Next. So our lungs have a huge surface area that is constantly interacting with air in our environment to exchange oxygen and as we breathe. And so the surface area of the human lungs is huge, about 100 meters squared. And so that's about the size of a tennis court. And size really matters for particulate pollution. So our natural defenses to protect us from dust or pollen is to cough or sneeze. For somewhat smaller particles, we have this thing called the mucociliary elevator, which traps those particles with mucus and then brings them up, and then we either cough them or swallow them. However, none of our defenses can help keep out the smaller fine or ultrafine particles from deep in our lung. And these particles get trapped in the lung tissue, and they can pass very quickly into the bloodstream as well. So more than 90% of diesel particulate matter is less than 1 micron in diameter, and most trap air pollution that causes health impacts is PM 2.5, so 2.5 microns or smaller, and generally comes from the combustion of fossil fuels. Next. Inhalation of diesel exhaust directly affects the respiratory. Oh, next, Cheryl, if you don't mind. Thanks. Inhalation of diesel exhaust directly affects the respiratory tract, but also leads to systemic effects throughout the human body via the bloodstream, and also systemic oxidative stress pathways, inflammatory cascades, genotoxicity. Next. So I think definitely we all have the impression that traffic-related air pollution is, worse if you're spending time near, near major roadways or highways, and the geography, of where we live or where we spend time is a big factor. So of course, that's where income disparities and racial disparities often come into play, and often people with lower socioeconomic status, for example, will have increased barriers to access to healthcare as well. So multiple factors that make air pollution as a health risk factor kind of worse, a multiplying effect. Next. So the health impacts of air pollution are complex, and they range in severity of impact. And in some cases, the damage can be quite gradual and may not be apparent for many years. So lots of the studies are epidemiologic or observational studies, so we can't always say that there's like a definite causal association, but we might say that it's likely or suspected depending on the strength of the evidence. And one of the first interventional studies came out of Dublin, Ireland, when they introduced a ban on coal sales in 1990, and black smoke concentrations fell by about 70%, and they studied death rates before and after the ban. And so respiratory deaths fell by about 15%, and cardiovascular deaths fell by 10%. So that gives you an idea of, that was pretty smoky air, but that's a good example. Next. And children are particularly vulnerable. And in pediatric care, we always say that children are not little adults. They behave differently. They experience the world differently. Their bodies are growing and changing quite rapidly. And, they play outside a lot more than adults on average. They're lower to the ground. They breathe quite a bit more quickly. And their blood-brain barrier is less robust. And if you think of the amount of air that a child inhales per unit body weight compared to adults, it's significantly more. So they're at greater risk. Next, I'll try and run through some health impacts of air pollution and diesel exhaust next. And I'm just highlighting some areas, but this is not an exhaustive list by any means. So reduced lung function is documented in studies, usually by measuring lung capacity using a tool called spirometry, or through symptom reporting, so presence of cough or wheeze. And there's likely a causal relationship between long-term TRAP exposure and reduced lung function in Canadians, and this has been shown in studies from other countries as well. And there's also evidence of an association between early life exposure to TRAP and reduced lung function among kids and adolescents. Next. The data shows significant increase in emergency room visits for respiratory diseases when air pollution levels go up, even in the short term. And this includes like acute upper respiratory tract infections, pneumonias, asthma, and COPD exacerbations. And there was a study in Ontario, for example, that looked at 9 communities across the province, and they showed increased numbers of all of these types of visits over the course of days following acute worsening of air pollution. Next. So air pollution is a known trigger for asthma, and asthma is a condition where inflamed airways obstruct airflow to the lungs, and it often makes that characteristic wheeze and shortness of breath. And it's important to know that asthma is like a major contributor to primary care and emergency room visits. And so there's definitely a causal relationship between long-term air pollution exposure and asthma in children, and exposure in the early years of life in particular is associated with greater risk of asthma onset as a preschooler. So a baby living in a home or apartment near a big road with elevated levels of air pollution is at much greater risk of developing asthma when they're, say, 2 or 3 years of age. And we know that short-term daily exposure also worsens asthma symptoms in school-age kids. Next, the evidence is strong for long-term, and I'll just have you move ahead the next one, Cheryl, just for as adult asthma as well. And then the next thing I'll talk about is COPD, which is an umbrella term for chronic bronchitis and emphysema. And smoking by far and away is the leading cause of COPD. Next. And at baseline, patients with COPD have significantly higher hospitalization rates compared to the general population. So about 63% higher hospitalization rates, 85 to 90% higher emergency room visits compared to people who don't have COPD, and about 50% more primary care visits. So COPD is a huge, cost to the healthcare system. And COPD exacerbations, when symptoms worsen such that patients need to use, may need to be prescribed antibiotics, may need extra medication, may be admitted to the hospital. These exacerbations definitely are associated with increased traffic-related air pollution exposure, both short-term and in the long term. And I'll just move on to the next one. So diesel, in terms of lung cancer, diesel is recognized as the carcinogen, and multiple studies have demonstrated that exposure to diesel exhaust is connected to increased risk for lung cancer, and that's the same for traffic-related air pollution in general. Next. And while smoking remains the biggest risk for lung cancer in Canada, we've done a really good job at reducing smoking rates across the population, but outdoor air pollution is still a really important risk, and it's a modifiable risk. Next. And in the same way that the dose of smoking matters in terms of your risk of lung cancer. So we often quantify that by asking people, how many pack years did they smoke for? This, is an example from a study that shows that the incidence rate of lung cancer increased with increasing duration and average concentration of air pollution. So there seems to be a dose-response relationship here. Next. And we see some association with leukemia in children. There's a nationwide case control study of kids in Italy that showed residential proximity to truck emissions led to about a 6-fold increased risk in the odds of developing leukemia. So that's fairly significant. Next. Just talking about reproduction and the prenatal period, there's certainly evidence to suggest risks for preterm birth, miscarriage, stillbirth, and especially low birth weight with air pollution exposure. And so you can see, especially the vulnerable time up till 8 or 9 weeks of gestation is when all the organs are forming, and they form super rapidly. So, very, very susceptible to environmental exposures at that point. And there is some emerging data that prenatal and early childhood exposure to ambient air pollution may increase the risk for autism spectrum disorders. That's kind of suggestive evidence at this point. Next, the prevalence of ADHD definitely seems to have a connection with prenatal and early in life exposures to TRAP. And if we look at the other end of the lifespan in terms of brain or neurologic impacts, there are associations with neurodegenerative impacts. So things like cognitive impairment in older adults, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. Next, cardiovascular disease is the big one. So short-term exposure, so just a few days of elevated air pollution levels can increase the risk for a heart attack, increase the risk of death, and also increase the risk of acute coronary syndrome. So that's kind of any condition that causes a sudden reduced blood flow to the heart. So that includes MI, but other conditions as well. And next, so long-term exposure obviously also has an impact. And again, we see that dose-response relationship. So the really big Women's Health Initiative observational study showed that increasing air pollution concentrations led to increasing cardiovascular events, whether it be, MI or ACS, and increased death, increased stroke. And next slide, just highlighting once again that low socioeconomic status and also racialized populations tend to face all of these risks at much higher levels, partly because of exposure to the traffic-related air pollution, but also barriers to healthcare access and other social causes that lead to worse health outcomes. Next, I really like this pyramid, which is a good visual to help us understand on a population level that even a small reduction in air pollution is going to have significant health benefits and social and economic benefits. So you can imagine that, if we're able to reduce air pollution, we're going to see fewer, in terms of magnitude of impacts, fewer people who are going to, have those years of life lost or death, fewer doctor's appointments, prescriptions for puffers, fewer asthma attacks, fewer COPD exacerbations with people ending up spending time in the emergency room or getting admitted to hospital, and just reducing that pollution at the population level is going to have really big impacts. Next, so the last slide is just prevention and protection from traffic-related air pollution. And today with talking about electric school buses, we're talking about, basically pollution prevention and control strategy. And so I think, there are other strategies too, and I think it's really important to highlight increasing active transportation, which you did at the beginning of today's session, and then some other interventions that are notable as well. But I'll stop there and look forward to answering any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Waters. Let's move into some questions. I'm gonna ask a couple first, if that's okay, but please do feel free to add your questions to the chat. So let's start, Dr. Minet. We've been talking about electrifying school buses here, but I just wanted to ask, are there other options that we should be looking at? Should we be looking at fuel cells or hydrogen? Like, is our view too narrow here?
I don't think it is. I'm not an expert in hydrogen and fuel cells, but preliminary initiatives have showed that it's pretty complicated to have hydrogen as a fuel because there's lots of logistics involved and security for storage of hydrogen, production of hydrogen. and it doesn't seem to be a viable option so far at a large scale. And the issues we see with electricity are mainly the range of how long a vehicle can drive, but like we don't have any storage issues and like security with safety, with handling the type of fuel, why this is not the case for hydrogen.
Great, thanks very much, Dr. Monet. Dr. Waters, now that you've had a breath, listening to your presentation, it struck me that there is such extensive reporting on the negative health impacts of diesel exhaust, and I've just wanted to get your thoughts on how people are not more aware of this and why action is not already being taken at a much more rapid rate than it already is.
Well, I think one of the things about air pollution is we can't see it. It's insidious, like it's subtle. And, you know, if you're behind a diesel bus, sure, you might smell it, but like most of the time we don't really notice it. And the amounts, you know, the effects for a lot of these health implications, they do accrue over time. So, you know, of course, there are some short-term effects, but we don't see them visually, you know, we don't experience them right away. And I think also it is just an awareness thing. We're just, you know, used to using fossil fuel vehicles, and that's just part of life. And it hasn't been, you know, brought to people's attention as much. I mean, smoking was normalized, and it wasn't, you know, until about 40 or 50 years ago, and it took quite a concerted campaign to get people to recognize how big of a health hazard smoking was. And then it took quite a long time for things to shift in kind of public awareness. So we've tackled the smoking thing. People understand that now, and I think air pollution, you know, the case is building now that it should be addressed.
Thank you, thanks. Dr. Monet, the benefits of electric vehicles in terms of emissions, you've made very, very clear during your presentation. I suppose one thing that might not be clear is how we can now power these electric vehicles that we're calling for. So is there a clear pathway to powering an entire fleet of electric vehicles that doesn't involve just moving our emissions out of cities into power plants?
Yes and no. So we're pretty lucky in Canada to rely a lot on hydroelectricity production. And so there's no emissions really associated with those. And so, but in Ontario, there's a bit of natural gas production. And so that might be an issue. We certainly have the capacity to fuel more electric vehicles. Do we have the capacity, and how is it going to look like in terms of logistics if we turn all our vehicles into electric vehicles? This is pretty unclear. And I think the message is that electric vehicles are not going to be the solution, are not a long-term solution to our transportation issues and traffic and transportation issues. And because we still need to produce those vehicles, we still need to fuel them, so electricity production. And so one path towards making sure that we reduce the impact of traffic-related air pollution would be, yes, to convert some vehicles to electric vehicles, but really would be to reduce the amount of vehicles on the roads. And that comes by encouraging active transportation, encouraging public transit buses, really. And I've actually seen a few questions or comments looking at like bikers and pedestrians' exposure to air pollution. And I think comes back to what Eugenie was saying regarding who's exposed the most. It's you have lower social economic status are going to could imply that some people are actually not relying on vehicles are relying on like walking, biking to move around, and those are going to be those people the most exposed. And that's the issue with our current system, is those who decide not to drive, who cannot drive, like kids or other people, or who decide not to drive and take the bike, those are the most vulnerable to air pollution. And so there's kind of a unbalance in the system.
Thank you. Yes, and I saw in the chat as well, Jen Humphreys had written about the importance of anti-idling mandates. And of course, school buses are very slow moving vehicles that are either moving slowly through a residential neighborhood or indeed idling there. So yes, the anti-idling mandates can't be, or their importance can't be overlooked in this conversation. Thank you for that, Dr. Minet. Dr. Eugenie, is there any way for, I was going to say us, but for you to gauge how much pressure would be taken off of the healthcare system if we made a transition like this?
Yeah, I mean, the current healthcare crisis, largely, human resources and the pandemic, et cetera. But, I think just in one of my slides, I showed that the COMPARE study looking at risk factor attribution in cancers in the Canadian population, about 1,700 lung cancer cases per year could be averted. For example. And so when I'm working as a hospitalist on medical oncology, that's all patients who are admitted with complications of cancer or complications of their cancer treatment. Lung cancer is a very, cancer that results in a lot of hospital admissions, very high healthcare utilization, for example. And COPD and asthma, that is like bread and butter reasons for same-day visits in a family practice environment, huge number of visits to emergency rooms, and causes of admission, like pediatric admissions, asthma exacerbations is a major issue. So, I mean, as Dr. Minet has shown, we're not going to get like a, right away changing of the fleet all to electric, but the faster that happens, the more we're going to see those health benefits accrue, and some of them are very immediate. So the asthma exacerbations, COPD exacerbations, there's pretty strong suggestion that just acute upper respiratory tract infections, air pollution is a risk factor for that. So that's just like common everyday coughs and colds. It's not to say air pollution is the only cause, but it's a risk factor for increasing numbers of those. And all of these things lead to, healthcare utilization, sick days, people not being able to work, et cetera. So can't give you a number, but significant.
Thank you so much. Tony Martins asks if we know the percentage of diesel school buses versus alternative fuel school buses. Tony, I can tell you in Ontario, we have 20 electric school buses out of our 20,000. I hope that answers your question. I don't know if there are any other, like a pilot type of, like a hydrogen type of bus. Certainly I haven't heard of them, but as far as I know, we're looking at about 0.1% alternatives to diesel school buses across Ontario. Okay, Raymond, I see you have a question here. Do you want to speak to it directly?
Sure. So
on the hydrogen question. Sorry.
Sure. So like I said in the comments there, we at EFCO have looked at hydrogen, and if you would have talked to me 20 years ago, I would have told you hydrogen would be the solution, emissions-free solution. But if you look at the basic science and physics behind it, the overall efficiency of using hydrogen is about 3 times lower than using battery electric directly. So because of that, and there's all sorts of other reasons, we believe hydrogen will never be a viable solution for the light duty fleet. Definitely, we also are believing that it won't be a solution for heavy duty vehicles either. So it's really based on the fact that given that it takes 3 times more electricity to do it the hydrogen way, it's always going to be more expensive. There's just no way around that. So so that's what we've come to the conclusion of.
Thank you so much for that, Raymond. And I see in the chat that Jay MacArthur has put some links to some CAPE materials in relation to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Well worth having a look. I will pull everything from the chat if people have put links in there, and it will go to everybody as a follow-up. So if you don't copy it or open it quickly enough, don't worry, you will get it later. Aaron, I see you've linked in a podcast there. Thank you for that. Okay, now I don't want to miss any questions. Ethan has asked many questions all at once. Ethan, do you have a preference? Maybe would you like to ask one question? We're 3 minutes before we wrap up. So
sure, it's just on funding. You know, schools are a mix of jurisdictions between, of course, the boards themselves, but then the cities, which are cash strapped, and the province, which in Ontario is not, canceled the electric school bus pilot and doesn't seem like it will be interested in making huge steps on, you know, any kind of positive direction for climate change. Is there an idea for how we would fund these kinds of things? Can we go to the federal government and create direct relationships there? That's my question.
Great question. And yes, Ethan, Ethan's referring to the money comes from for transportation in Ontario comes from the Ontario Education Ministry and goes directly into the school boards, then for the transportation consortia, and then they send out contracts for private bus operators. So it's quite a convoluted series of links in Ontario. The funding to match the federal funding that is the Zero Emission Transit Fund I mentioned earlier, that would need to come from the Transportation Ministry in Ontario, in my opinion, because they set up the pilot scheme in the first place. And so, yes, they are the types of relationships that we would need to be building on. There is also a question at the federal level of possibly extending the Zero Emission Transit Fund because that funding has an expiry date. It will run out not too far from now. So there are a couple of things that we need to be working on, but certainly the Transportation Ministry in Ontario is where we're going. Okay, very quickly.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, perhaps there's an opportunity here to even move to public ownership of the school transportation system as the fleet turns over, instead of continuing to rely on private delivery. Maybe our school boards should just be owning these buses themselves.
I'll leave that question for another day, but I'll just say that if you look in the report, you can see the economic arguments for electric school buses are vast. There is such a cost saving that can be made to taxpayers that I think actually at some point the progressive Conservatives are going to have to realize the economic advantages in the longer term, and not just look at, okay, yes, the initial cost is higher, look at the longer picture and say we can save a lot of money over the longer term. Well, I want to thank you for your fantastic questions, and I'm sorry that we haven't had time to get through all of them. Quickly, I just want to thank so much Dr. Laura Minet, Dr. Eugenie Waters, and the University of Victoria, and the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment, sharing your expertise with us today. We've really appreciated it. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As I say, the recording will be available, and we will share a version of the slides with you sometime in the next week. I'd like to thank you for taking part in this very thought-provoking discussion that is so important and affects every one of our everyday lives right now. So thank you so much. We wish you all the best. Hope you join us in the future and have a lovely rest of your week.